On the morning of May 26, 2026, the Russian military's Southern Operational Grouping, the command structure responsible for coordinating every Russian ground, artillery, and air asset across the Zaporizhzhia and Kherson axes, transmitted an internal assessment to Moscow that its own authors flagged as requiring immediate strategic review. The assessment did not describe a front line under pressure. It did not describe a sector requiring reinforcement. It described a front line that was, in the precise language of the translated intercept subsequently shared with European defense partners by Ukrainian military intelligence, experiencing cascading positional failures across multiple simultaneous axes without available reserve capacity to arrest the deterioration. In plain language, the Southern Front was coming apart in more places than Russia had the forces to hold, and the commanders responsible for holding it were telling Moscow they could not do it. This was not a tactical report from a brigade under fire. It was a strategic confession from an operational command that had just watched Putin's biggest battlefield gamble collapse beneath it, a gamble that had committed Russia's remaining southern reserves to a concentrated offensive push that was supposed to break Ukrainian defensive coherence on the Zaporizhzhia axis once and for all, and that had instead broken the offensive capacity of the forces that executed it. If this is your first time here and you want the analysis that goes beneath the surface of this war, the doctrine, the systems, the operational picture that daily coverage never reaches, hit like and subscribe right now, because this is exactly what this channel is built to deliver. Now, let's get into it. The gamble but failed had been in preparation since late April 2026, when Russian Southern Command, assessing that the Zaporizhzhia axis represented the most favorable terrain for a concentrated breakthrough attempt, began quietly repositioning its last significant uncommitted reserve, a grouping of 4 reinforced regiment-sized formations that had been held back from frontline attrition operations since February specifically to preserve their combat effectiveness for a decisive moment. The repositioning was conducted with a kind of operational security discipline that Russian command had been attempting to implement across all major force movements following the intelligence failures of the spring campaign. Movement was conducted at night. Electronic emissions were suppressed. Communications between the repositioning formations and Southern Command headquarters were routed through newly configured relay architecture specifically to avoid the traffic signature patterns that Ukrainian signals intelligence had exploited in previous operations. By mid-May, the grouping was in position. By May 22nd, the assault plan had been finalized and distributed to subordinate commanders, and on the morning of May 25th, with artillery preparation beginning at 4:30 and ground forces crossing their line of departure at 6:15, Putin's biggest southern gamble began. By 14 o'clock the same day, it was over. The 4 formations had advanced an average of 2.3 kilometers across a front that Russian planning had projected would yield 8 to 12 kilometers of penetration depth by end of day. Ukrainian defensive lines had bent but had not broken, and the formations that had executed the assault were, by the operational assessment of their own commanders, no longer capable of sustained offensive action without a reconstitution period of 3 to 4 weeks minimum. Russia had spent its last southern reserve and bought less than 3 kilometers of ground. The unraveling that followed was not a consequence of that single day. It was the consequence of everything that had led to it. But the failure of the May 25th assault was not the real story. The real story was what the assault's failure exposed about the structural condition of Russia's southern front, a condition that had been developing beneath the surface of the operational reporting for months, and that the commitment and destruction of Russia's last southern reserve had now made impossible to manage or conceal. The real story was that the southern front had been held together not by genuine defensive depth or adequate reserve capacity, but by the existence of that uncommitted grouping as a deterrent, its presence in reserve, creating enough uncertainty in Ukrainian planning about where Russia might concentrate force to prevent Ukraine from exploiting the thinning of Russian frontline positions that the spring campaign's attritional losses had produced. With that grouping now spent, the deterrent effect was gone, and Ukraine, whose intelligence picture of Russian southern force disposition was, as the spring campaign had demonstrated, significantly more complete than Moscow understood, began acting on the opportunity within hours of the May 25th assault culminating. To understand why the unraveling accelerated so rapidly after that point, you first need to understand what Russia's southern defensive architecture actually looked like beneath the surface numbers, and why the loss of its reserve destroyed the coherence of the entire system. To understand why Russia's southern front is now unraveling, you first need to understand the structural logic of how Russia had been maintaining its southern defensive and offensive posture through the spring of 2026, despite the accumulating the pressures of supply chain degradation, elite force losses, and the intelligence failures that had cost it 3 major operations in 8 weeks. The southern front, spanning approximately 340 kilometers from the Dnipro River line through Zaporizhzhia and into the western Donetsk approaches, was being held by a Russian force that was, by late May 2026, operating at significantly below the theoretical manning and equipment levels its defensive assignments required. The shortfalls had been produced by a combination of factors: attritional casualties that had not been fully replaced, equipment losses that domestic production had not fully compensated, and the diversion of higher quality units to the Donetsk axis, where the grinding advance toward Pokrovsk and Kramatorsk had been consuming forces at rates that Southern Command's requests for reinforcement could not compete with. What had kept the Southern Front functionally coherent despite these shortfalls was a combination of 3 factors. The first was terrain. The open steppe of the Zaporizhzhia region favored a defender with adequate artillery and anti-armor coverage, and Russian forces had used their time since the failed Ukrainian counteroffensive of 2023 to construct layered defensive positions whose physical depth partially compensated for manning shortfalls. The second was fires. Density Russian artillery on the southern axis had maintained a firing rate that, while below the levels achieved on the more actively contested Donetsk front, was sufficient to impose significant costs on any Ukrainian attempt to probe or exploit the thinly held sections of the line. The third was the existence of the uncommitted reserve grouping, whose presence created the deterrent uncertainty described above. Remove the third factor, and the first 2 become insufficient. The terrain still favors defense, but defense requires soldiers to hold it. The fire's density still imposes costs on Ukrainian advances, but fires without infantry cannot hold ground against a determined assault. Russia's southern front had been a defended line sustained by the threat of a reserve that could seal any breach. The reserve is gone. What remains is a defended line that cannot seal its own breaches, and Ukraine has identified exactly where those breaches are. The pace at which Ukrainian forces began exploiting the post-assault Russian vulnerability is the detail that crystallizes everything about how completely Ukraine's operational picture had anticipated the moment the Southern Reserve was spent, within 4 hours of Russian assault forces culminating on May 25th, while Russian unit commanders were still transmitting their damage assessments and requesting reconstitution guidance. Ukrainian forces on 3 separate sections of the Zaporizhzhia front began probe operations that, by nightfall, had identified 2 sectors where Russian defensive coverage had fallen below the threshold required to repel a coordinated assault. By the morning of May 26th, Ukrainian assault elements had pushed through both sectors, advancing between 4 and 7 kilometers in each case against Russian defensive positions whose crews, according to intercepts reviewed by Ukrainian intelligence, had been stripped of their normal fire support coordination because Southern Command, as communications architecture still partially degraded from the May 2nd spoofing operation, could not simultaneously manage the assault culmination crisis and coordinate defensive fires across the full front widths. By midday on May 26th, the cascading positional failures described in Southern Command's internal assessment were not a projection. They were an ongoing operational reality. And the assessment's conclusion that available reserve capacity was insufficient to arrest the deterioration was not a warning about the future. It was a description of the present, not damaged, not disrupted, unraveled. The full arc of how Russia arrived at this strategic moment on its southern front deserves to be told from the point at which the decisions that produced it were made. not May 2026, but the autumn of 2025, when Russian military command made a series of resource allocation choices that prioritized the Donetsk axis grinding advance over the maintenance of adequate southern front reserve depth. The logic was defensible at the time. The Donetsk advance was producing measurable territorial gains, slow, costly, but continuous toward objectives that Russian planning assessed as strategically significant. The southern front, by contrast, had been static since the failure of the Ukrainian counteroffensive in 2023, and Russian planning assessed the probability of a major Ukrainian offensive action on the Zaporizhzhia axis as low given Ukrainian force constraints and the formidable depth of Russian defensive construction in the region. The allocation decision therefore directed reinforcement, replacement personnel, and priority equipment deliveries toward Donetsk, while the southern front was maintained at the minimum force levels. Assessed as adequate for a static defensive mission, that assessment carried a hidden assumption that would prove catastrophically wrong, that the static defensive mission on the southern front would remain static. It assumed that the attritional pressures accumulating across the Russian military system throughout the spring of 2026, the supply chain failures, the elite force losses, the covert infrastructure dismantlement, would not reach a threshold that created genuine offensive opportunity for Ukraine on an axis that Russian planning had designated as secondary. That assumption failed because it treated each of the spring's operational reverses as an isolated event rather than as a cumulative system-wide degradation. Each individual failure was assessed as manageable. The combination was not. By the time Southern Command's last reserve was committed on May 25th and spent, the cumulative degradation had reached a threshold that the autumn 2025 resource allocation model had never modeled and could not have compensated for, even if its authors had recognized what was coming. Step back now to the full campaign, because the unraveling of Russia's southern front is not an isolated operational crisis. It is the point at which the cumulative strategic consequences of the entire spring 2026 campaign become simultaneously and visibly operative on a single front. The Gray Mirror dismantlement removed Russia's precision component supply resilience. The Voronezh strike set back its hypersonic development program by up to 3 years. The Southern Command communications spoofing degraded its command coordination architecture on the most active operational axis. The propellant crisis exposed a logistics fragility that the headline production numbers had been concealing. The May 17th deception operation demonstrated that Ukrainian counteroffensive action could reverse weeks of Russian positional gain in 18 hours. The May 21st covert network dismantlement removed the invisible support infrastructure, sustaining Russian capabilities that domestic production could not provide. The destruction of Russia's elite assault formations on May 24th consumed the operational quality reserve that distinguished Russian offensive capability from simple positional attrition, and the failure of the May 25th Southern Gamble spent the last uncommitted Southern reserve, removing the deterrent that had been holding the front's structural inadequacies together. These are not 8 separate events. They are 8 load-bearing elements of Russian campaign sustainability that have been removed, one by one, over a 10-week period. The Southern Front's unraveling is what the cumulative structure looks like when enough load-bearing elements are gone simultaneously. It is not a frontline crisis. It is a strategic accounting. Now come to the full implications of the cascading positional failures that Southern Command's internal assessment described, because the operational consequences of what is now unfolding on the Zaporizhzhia axis extend well beyond the immediate territorial picture. The 2 Ukrainian penetration sectors identified on May 26 are not, in isolation, strategically decisive. 4 to 7 kilometers of advance in open terrain against a disorganized defense does not immediately threaten Russian-held population centers or critical logistics infrastructure. What it does is force Russian command into an impossible allocation problem. To seal the penetration sectors and restore defensive coherence on the Zaporizhzhia axis, Russia must commit forces from somewhere. Those forces do not exist on the Southern Front. Southern Command has already told Moscow as much in explicit terms. They must therefore come from the Donetsk axis, where the grinding advance that has been the primary metric of Russian offensive success for 18 months is ongoing, and where any reduction in committed force levels will slow or halt the advances that Russian information operations have been citing as evidence of campaign momentum. The choice Moscow now faces is between accepting the continued deterioration of the southern front and allowing Ukrainian penetrations to deepen toward operationally significant depth, or stripping Donetsk forces to stabilize the south and accepting the stalling of the advance that has been the visible symbol of Russian campaign progress. Neither option is acceptable. Both are the only options available, and that impossible allocation problem forced on Moscow by the cumulative degradation of a campaign that has been absorbing system-wide shocks since March is itself the strategic consequence that the spring 2026 campaign has been building toward. Russia is not being defeated on a single front. It is being forced to choose which front to lose. Here is the final strategic reality that the unraveling of Russia's southern front illuminates. The Russian military entered 2026 with a campaign strategy built on three interdependent pillars. The first was industrial sustainability. The belief that Russian defense industrial output had been successfully scaled to wartime levels sufficient to sustain the campaign's material requirements indefinitely. The second was operational security. The belief that Russian intelligence and deception measures had been sufficiently improved to prevent Ukraine from anticipating and preempting major Russian operations at the cost it had imposed in 2024 and early 2025. The third was strategic depth, the belief that Russia retained sufficient uncommitted reserve capacity at both the force level and the logistics level to absorb setbacks on one axis while maintaining momentum on another, and to seal breaches before they became operational ruptures. The spring 2026 campaign has systematically invalidated all three pillars. The propellant crisis and the precision component supply disruptions have demonstrated that industrial sustainability is shallower and more brittle than the production headline numbers suggested. The May 17th, May 24th, and May 25th operational failures have demonstrated that operational security has not improved to the point where it can reliably protect major force commitments from Ukrainian deception and ambush. And the destruction of the elite assault formations and the exhaustion of the Southern Reserve have demonstrated that strategic depth has been consumed to a point where Russia can no longer absorb a major setback on one axis without accepting unmanageable deterioration on another. All three pillars are gone. What remains is a military that is still fighting, still generating fires, still holding most of its current positions, but doing so without the systemic resilience that has allowed it to absorb punishment and continue across 4 years of war. The question that the Southern Front's unraveling poses is therefore not whether Russia's position is deteriorating, it visibly is, but whether the deterioration is approaching the threshold at which it becomes self-reinforcing, where each new failure reduces the capacity to prevent the next one, and the cascade that Southern Command described in its May 26th assessment spreads from the Southern Front to the system as a whole. That threshold does not have a clean address on a map, but the distance to it, measured in the currency of reserve capacity, logistics, resilience, and operational coherence, is shorter today than it has been at any point in this war. And in Moscow's strategic planning rooms tonight, the people who understand that are not sleeping well. What do you think this comes down to? Has the cumulative degradation of the spring 2026 campaign pushed the Russian military past the threshold where its southern front deterioration becomes self-reinforcing and spreads to the broader campaign, or does Russia retain enough residual depth in its mobilization base, its defense industrial output, and its remaining front-line cohesion to stabilize the South, absorb the losses, and continue at reduced but sustainable tempo through the summer? Tell me in the comments, and if this channel is where you come for the real strategic picture, the systems, the doctrine, the operational reality beneath the headlines, make sure you are subscribed, because what is unfolding here is the most consequential phase of this war yet. and you should not be watching it from anywhere else.